Hello there. Welcome to today's episode where we will read through chapter 11 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This is not going to be a typical audiobook reading where I just read the words, because this is going to be for people who are learning English. Now, don't go away if you're a native speaker, because we're going to read it slowly. We're going to think about each sentence, each paragraph. We're going to talk about what things mean. And actually, the language in here is pretty complicated. So even for a native speaker, sometimes if you really want to understand the book, you have to very carefully consider all of the different sentences. Sometimes it's hard for me to explain it. Sometimes I can't. Sometimes I don't know what they mean. And I've learned some new words reading this book. So let's begin chapter 11. Before we do that, let's remember what happened in chapter 10. Davy's mother died, leaving Davy an orphan. And then the mother's funeral happened. And then Davy was alone with Miss Murdston and Mr. Murdston, his stepfather, and they hate him. And he was spending some time there. They were ignoring him, just letting him do whatever he wanted to. They wouldn't talk to him. And finally, Mr. Murdston decided that Davy needs to go away from the house. So he found him a job in London. And it sounds like it's going to be a very bad, unpleasant job. So in the end of chapter 10, Davy was waking up in the morning, getting ready to go to London to start his new life. Now, the title, and he's just a little boy, I think he's 10 years old. The title of chapter 11 is I Begin Life on My Own Account. And what that means is I'm in charge of my life now. So he's just a little boy. He's 10 years old. And he's saying, I'm in charge of my life now. And I don't like it. So that's the title of chapter 11. Which, if you're 20 or 30, that's a good thing. But if you're a little boy of 10, that's a horrible thing that he's in charge of his own life now. So he says, I'm in charge of my life now, and I don't like it. I know enough of the world now to have almost lost the capacity of being much surprised by anything. But it is a matter of some surprise to me, even now, that I can have been so easily thrown away at such an age. So he's writing this. These are his memoirs. He's writing this now when he's older. And he's saying, there's very little that surprises me after I've been an adult for so many years. But it still surprises me the way I was such a little boy and they just threw me away like that so easily. A child of excellent abilities and with strong powers of observation, quick, eager, delicate, and soon hurt, bodily or mentally. It seems wonderful to me that nobody should have made any sign in my behalf. So he's saying, I was such a smart boy, such a good boy. Why didn't anybody help me? Why didn't anybody defend me? Why didn't somebody come and rescue me? But none was made. And I became, at 10 years old, a little laboring hind in the service of Murdston and Grimby. So he became a laborer, a physical worker at this company, Murdston and Grimby, where they make wine products. Murdston and Grimby's warehouse was at the waterside. It was down in Blackfriars. Modern improvements have altered the place. But it was the last house at the bottom of a narrow street, curving downhill to the river, with some stairs at the end, where people took boat. It was a crazy old house with a wharf of its own, abutting on the water when the tide was in, and on the mud where the tide was out, and literally overrun with rats. Its paneled rooms, discolored with dirt and smoke of 100 years, I dare say, its decaying floors and staircase, the squeaking, scuffling old gray rats down in the cellars. Squeaking, that's the sound of a rat. Me, 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 me. Like that's this kind of a squeak, the sound that you would hear from a rat. And the dirty rottenness of the place are things not of many years ago in my mind, but of the present instant. They're all before me now, just as they were in the evil hour when I went among them for the first time, with my trembling hand in Mr. Quinyon's trembling hand. His hand was moving like this. So he's writing this as an adult, and he's saying, I can see it, I can still see every detail. I can still see it very clearly. Murdston and Grimby's trade was among a good many kind of people, but an important branch of it was the supply of wines and spirits to certain packet ships. I forget now where they chiefly went, but I think there were some among them that made voyages both to the East and the West Indies. I know that a great many empty bottles were one of the consequences of this traffic, and that certain men and boys were employed to examine them against the light and reject those that were flawed, and to rinse them and wash them. When empty bottles ran short, there were labels to be pasted on full ones, or corks to be fitted on them, or seals to be put on the corks, or finished bottles to be packed in casks. All this work was my work, and of the boys employed upon it, I was one. So his job was to wash bottles and pack boxes with bottles of wine and other types of alcohol. There were 3 or 4 of us, counting me. My workplace was established in a corner of the warehouse, where Mr. Quinyon could see me when he chose to stand upon the bottom rail of his stool in the counting house and look at me through the window above the desk. Hither, on the first morning of my so auspiciously beginning life on my own account, the oldest of the regular boys was summoned to show me my business. Now that word summon means come here, come to me. So the adults sent for the oldest boy. They said, "Old boy, come here. Show Davy around. Show him his job." His name was Mick Walker, and he wore a ragged apron and paper cap. He informed me that his father was a bargeman and walked in a black velvet headdress in the Lord Mayor's show. He also informed me that our principal associate would be another boy whom he'd introduce to me by the, to me, extraordinary name of Mealy Potatoes. I discovered, however, that this youth had not been christened by that name, but it had been bestowed upon him in the warehouse on account of his complexion. All right, so this boy, the oldest boy, is going to show him around, and he's going to introduce him to another boy whose name is Mealy Potatoes. And I just guess, I'm not really sure what Mealy Potatoes means. I'm guessing that maybe it's bumpy potatoes. Let me see. I doubt that there'll be a picture of this, but I'm just going to Google it anyway. Mealy potatoes. Well, it actually has a meaning. It's a type of potato. Let's see. I'm just going to ask, what are mealy potatoes? Mealy potatoes have a thick skin. So they say that obviously mealy potatoes was not the name his parents gave him, but the people at the workhouse, the children at the factory, gave him this because of the way his skin was. So his skin was like the skin of a rough potato. And that's why his nickname was Mealy Potatoes. Okay, let's see. Where are we? On account of his complexion, which was pale. Pale means he had no color in his skin, or mealy. Mealy's father was a waterman, who had the additional distinction of being a fireman, and was engaged as such at one of the large theaters, with some young relation of Mealy's, I think his little sister, did imps in the pantomimes. No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sunk into this companionship, compared these henceforth everyday associates with those of my happier childhood, not to say with Steerforth, Traddles, and the rest of those boys, and felt my hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my bosom. So now he's remembering the school where he was at. They were beating him. They were horrible. The teachers, the owner of the school. But he had really good friends there. And the fact that he was getting an education, he knew that he was going to go somewhere in life. And now suddenly he was surrounded by these people, like this boy showing him around, and mealy potatoes. And he was kind of comparing these boys to the boys that he was friends with just a few months ago. And it gave him a very horrible feeling, thinking about what his future might be now that he's in the company of these people instead. The deep remembrance of the sense I had of being utterly without hope now, of the shame I felt in my position, of the misery it was to my young heart to believe that day by day what I had learned and thought and delighted in and raised my fancy and my emulation up by would pass away from me, little by little, never to be brought back any more. It cannot be written. So Davy's saying, all of my dreams are gone. My future is gone. And there's no way to even express it. As often as Mick Walker went away in the course of the forenoon, I mingled my tears with the water in which I was washing the bottles, and sobbed as if there were a flaw in my own breast, and it were in danger of bursting. The counting-house clock was at 12:30, and there was general preparation for going to dinner, when Mr. Quinion tapped at the counting-house window and beckoned me to go in. So remember, we had that word summon, which means come here, and now we have this word beckon, which also means come here. So they both mean come here. So Mr. Quinion beckoned Davy to come to him. I went in and found there was a stoutish, middle-aged person in a brown surtout and black tights and shoes. What's a surtout? I wonder if that's a French word and it should be pronounced surtout. Let's see. I'm just going to spell it and see what it is. Surtout. A man's overcoat. And yes, it probably should be pronounced surtout. So it's a type of, let's see if there's a picture of a surtout. Okay. So that's the type of thing that you would expect around the 1840s or 1850s somebody to be wearing. So it's this type of coat that's a surtout. Just in case you wanted to know. It's not exactly useful English, but now we know what a surtout is. All right. Let's reread that. I went in and found there was a stoutish middle-aged person in a brown surtout and black tights and shoes, with no more hair upon his head, which was a large one and very shining, than there is upon an Easter egg. So he was bald, very bald, no hair at all, and with a very extensive face, which he turned full upon me. His clothes were shabby. That means his clothes were old and in bad condition. But he had an imposing shirt collar on. He carried a jaunty sort of stick with a large pair of rusty tassels on it, and a quizzing glass hung outside his coat for ornament. Whoops. I afterwards found that he very seldom looked through it, and couldn't see anything when he did. This, said Mr. Quinion, in allusion to myself, is he. This, said the stranger, with a certain condescending roll in his voice and a certain indescribable air of doing something genteel, which impressed me very much, is Master Copperfield. I hope I see you well, sir. So this man is acting... What's the word that we should say? He's acting very overly polite, which makes Davy wonder about him. I said I was very well, and hoped that he was. I was sufficiently ill at ease, heaven knows, but it was not in my nature to complain much at that time of my life. So I said I was well, and hoped that he was. I, said the stranger, thank heaven, quite well. I have received a letter from Mr. Murdstone, that's Davy's stepfather, in which he mentions that he would desire me to receive into an apartment in the rear of my house, which is at present unoccupied, and is, in short, to be let as in short, said the stranger with a smile, and in a burst of confidence, as a bedroom, the young beginner, who I have now here the pleasure to, and the stranger waved his hand and settled his chin in his collar. Okay, well, I already am very familiar with this book, and this character is Mr. Micawber. This is Mr. Micawber, said Mr. Quinion to me. Now, the thing about Mr. Micawber is that he uses very complicated language because he thinks it makes him look sophisticated and dignified, but it's extremely hard to understand sometimes what he's saying because the language he uses is so ridiculous and so complicated. So it's going to be hard to understand anything Mr. Micawber says, because it's always indirect, and he always uses very flowery words. This is Mr. Micawber, said Mr. Quinion to me. Ahem, said the stranger. That is my name. Mr. Micawber, said Mr. Quinion, is known to Mr. Murdstone. He takes orders for us on commission when he can get any. He has been written to by Mr. Murdstone on the subject of your lodgings, and he will receive you as a lodger. So Mr. Murdstone, Davy's father-in-law, has written to Mr. Micawber. They do business together sometimes, and asked Mr. Micawber to let Davy stay at his home. They would rent a room. Mr. Murdstone would pay for a room for Davy in Mr. Micawber's home. So that's what's happening here. That's where Davy is staying. Remember, in chapter 10, the Murdstone said, "Well, we will pay for your room. The money that you make from working in the factory you can use that for food or whatever you want, and we'll pay for your room. They have to do that much for him because Mr. Murdstone is responsible for him. He's his stepfather. My address, said Mr. Micawber, is Windsor Terrace, City Road. In short, said Mr. Micawber with the same genteel air. Genteel is like they're spelling it in a funny way here, but it's like the French word for gentle. So genteel means like somebody who's a gentleman, who's very refined. So he's not refined. He wears clothes that are old and have holes in them, and he's very poor, but he always acts refined, and he always talks that way. So he, with a genteel air. And in another burst of confidence, I live there. I made him a bow. Under the impression, said Mr. Micawber, that your peregrinations in this metropolis have not as yet been extensive, and that you might have some difficulty in penetrating the arcana of the modern Babylon in the direction of the City Road. In short, said Mr. Micawber, in another burst of confidence, that you might lose yourself. I shall be happy to call this evening and install you in the knowledge of the nearest way. So that Mr. Micawber is saying, since you don't know the city very well, I will come here tonight and I will take you to your room. What are peregrinations? I'm going to look up that word. These are definitely not words that you would want to use in regular conversation. Peregrination. A peregrination is a journey, a long, meandering journey. Let's see. Well, let's go back and read that again. Let's see if we can decipher what Mr. Micawber is saying. Under the impression, said Mr. Micawber, that your peregrinations in this metropolis. So a normal person would say city, but Mr. Micawber chooses to use these really strange words that mean the same thing. So metropolis is a city. So let's see, that your journeys, your travels inside of this city have not as yet been extensive. So what he's saying is, I know that you're not familiar with the city. This is Mr. Micawber's way of saying, I know that you're not familiar with the city. And that you might have some difficulty in penetrating the arcana of the modern Babylon in the direction of the City Road. I'm not going to try to decipher that, okay, but he's just saying, I know that you don't know the city. I will come here later tonight, and I will take you. Okay, I thanked him with all of my heart, for it was friendly of him to offer to take that trouble. At what hour, said Mr. Micawber, shall I... At about 8, said Mr. Quinion. At about 8, said Mr. Micawber. I beg to wish you good day, Mr. Quinion. I will intrude no longer. So he put on his hat and went out with his cane under his arm, very upright, and humming a tune when he was clear of the counting-house. Mr. Quinion then formally engaged me to be as useful as I could in the warehouse of Mr. Murdstone and Grimby at a salary, I think, of 6 shillings a week. I am not clear whether it was 6 or 7. I am inclined to believe, from my uncertainty on this head, that it was 6 at first and 7 afterwards. He paid me a week down from his own pocket, I believe, and I gave Mealy 6pence out of it to get my trunk carried to Windsor Terrace that night, it being too heavy for my strength, small as it was. I paid 6pence more for my dinner, which was a meat pie, and a turn at a neighbouring pump, and passed the hour, which was allowed for that meal, and walking about the streets. At the appointed time, Mr. Micawber reappeared. I washed my hands and face to do the greater honor to his gentility, and we walked to our house. So because Mr. Micawber is always speaking in such a genteel way, Davy felt it necessary to wash his hands and face to look nice for him, so that he wouldn't be offended by his dirtiness. And we walked to our house, as I suppose I must call it now, together, Mr. Micawber impressing the names of the streets and the shapes of the corner houses upon me. And we went along, as we went along, that I might find my way back easily in the morning. So as they're walking to the house, Mr. Micawber is showing Davy the streets. This is street number 1, this is street number 2, telling him the names, so that Davy can orient himself in the city, so that he can find his way, so that he can return in the morning to work. Arrived at this house in Windsor Terrace, which I noticed was shabby like himself. Remember, he was dressed in shabby clothes. That means the clothes were in bad condition. They were old and maybe a little bit dirty, or they had holes. And he said the house was also shabby. So the house where they lived, it didn't look nice. It looked like it was neglected, like they needed to take care of it more. He presented me to Mrs. Micawber, a thin and faded lady, not at all young, who was sitting in the parlor. The first floor was altogether unfurnished, and the blinds were kept down to delude the neighbors, with a baby at her breast. This baby was one of twins. And I may remark here that I hardly ever, in all my experience of the family, saw both of the twins detached from Miss Micawber at the same time. One of them was always taking refreshment, so Miss Micawber always had one of the twins with her. Davy's saying, I never saw her without one of the babies. There was always one baby with her. There were 2 other children, Master Micawber, aged about 4, and Miss Micawber, aged about 3. These and a dark-complexioned young woman with the habit of snorting, that's snorting, who was a servant to the family, and informed me, before half an hour had expired, that she was orphaling. I don't know what that means. Oh, she was an orphaling. Okay, I think that means she was an orphan. And she came from St. Luke's workhouse in the neighborhood, completed the establishment. My room was at the top of the house at the back, a close chamber, stenciled all over with an ornament. You know, they've used that word close before, C-L-O-S-E, with chamber. That's not the first time, but I don't know. I ignored it the first time, thinking, well, let's see, room, does it say? No. Closed chamber, but not closed chamber. I'm not really sure what that means. And Google's no help. As usual. A closed chamber, stenciled all over with an ornament which my young imagination represented as a blue muffin, and very scantily furnished. Scantily means not very much. If something is scanty, it means there isn't a lot. So if the room is scantily furnished, that means there really isn't any furniture in the room. Maybe there's just a bed and a table, and that's it, and maybe a chair, and nothing more. I never thought, said Mrs. Micawber, when she came up, twin and all, to show me the apartment and sat down to take breath, before I was married, when I lived with Papa and Mamma, that I should ever find it necessary to take a lodger. But Mr. Micawber, being in difficulties, All considerations of private feelings must give way. So Mrs. Micawber feels a little bit ashamed that they have to rent this room to Davy. She thinks it's embarrassing that they need the money, and so they have to let him have this room. Mr. Micawber's difficulties are almost overwhelming just at present, said Mrs. Micawber. And whether it is possible to bring him through them, I don't know. When I lived at home with Papa and Mamma, I really should have hardly understood what the word meant, in the sense in which I now employ it. But experientia does it, as Papa used to say. So it seems like Mrs. Micawber had a very comfortable life when she was growing up, and now she married Mr. Micawber, and they're always having financial problems. I cannot satisfy myself whether she told me that Mr. Micawber had been an officer in the Marines, or whether I have imagined it. I only know that I believe to this hour that he was in the Marines once upon a time, without knowing why. He was a sort of town traveler for a number of miscellaneous houses now, but made little or nothing of it, I'm afraid. If Mr. Micawber's creditors will not give him time, said Mrs. Micawber, they must take the consequences, and the sooner they bring it to an issue, the better. Blood cannot be obtained from stone, neither can anything on account be obtained at present, not to mention law expenses from Mr. Micawber. So Mr. Micawber owes some people money, and he doesn't have the money to pay. And Mrs. Micawber is complaining they have to give us more time. There's no other choice because we don't have anything. I never can quite understand whether my precious self-dependence confused Miss Micawber in reference to my age, or whether she was so full of the subject that she would have talked about it to the very twins if there had been nobody else to communicate with. But this was the strain in which she began, and she went on accordingly all the time I knew her. So just imagine that. Davy is just a little 10-year-old boy, and here's this mother of four, this married woman of four, bringing him to his room, telling him all about her financial troubles, all about the family's financial troubles. And Davy is kind of confused. Why is she telling me this? And he's saying, she started this on the first day, telling me these things, and she never stopped until, from the moment I met her until now. She always talks about it. Poor Mrs. Micawber. She said she had tried to exert herself, and so I have no doubt she had. The center of the street door was perfectly covered with a great brass plate, on which was engraved Mrs. Micawber's boarding establishment for young ladies. But I never found that any young lady had ever been to school there, or that any young lady ever came or proposed to come, or that at least preparation was ever made to receive any young lady. The only visitors I ever saw or heard of were creditors. They used to come at all hours, and some of them were quite ferocious. So it seems like Miss Micawber tried to start a business for young ladies. I mean, my understanding of the word boarding house, it's like a hotel, but more permanent. So I don't know if they have boarding houses now, but it used to be if you arrived in a town and you planned to stay there for several weeks, you could go to this house. It was literally a house, and rent a room. And board means that they give you food, they feed you. So room and board means you rent a room and they also feed you and take care of you. It's kind of like being in a family, but you're paying. And that used to be very common. And that's what I understand a boarding house to be here. But Davy's talking about schooling here, so I don't know if boarding house in this situation means like the girls stay there and Miss Micawber teaches them things. I'm not sure. But the point is she tried to start a business for young ladies to live there, to stay there, but there was never any young ladies. The only people Davy ever saw come to the house were angry creditors, angry people who Mr. Micawber owed money. One dirty-faced man, I think he was a bootmaker, used to edge himself into the passageway as early as 7 o'clock. As early as 7 o'clock in the morning, and call up the stairs to Mr. Micawber. "Come! You ain't out yet, you know. Pay us, will you? Don't hide, you know. That's mean. I wouldn't be mean if I was you. Pay us, will you? You just pay us. Do you hear? Come." Receiving no answer to these taunts, he would mount in his wrath to the words, "Swindlers!" That's like cheaters. "Robbers!" And being ineffectual, too, would sometimes go to the extremity of crossing the street and roaring up to the windows of the second floor, where he knew Mr. Micawber was. At these times, Mr. Micawber would be transported with grief and mortification, even to the length, as I was once made aware by a scream from his wife, of making motions at himself with a razor. But within half an hour afterwards, he would polish up his shoes with extraordinary pains and go out. So this was very embarrassing for Mr. Micawber. These people would come asking for money, and they would be hollering outside, "Pay us!" So that could be very embarrassing, especially for somebody like Mr. Micawber, who obviously tries to give the impression that he's a very special, dignified sort of person, a very genteel person, and even to the point where he was considering killing himself, suicide. But eventually, when these people went away, he would change his attitude and be happy again. But within a half an hour afterwards, he would polish up his shoes with extraordinary pains. So he would polish his shoes, make sure they look very nice, and go out humming a tune with a great air of gentility than ever. Mrs. Micawber was quite elastic. I have known her to be thrown into fainting fits by the king's taxes at 3 o'clock, and to eat lamb chops breaded and drink warm ale, paid for with 2 teaspoons that had gone to the pawnbrokers, at 4. Okay, so at 3 o'clock, she was panicking about owing money, but then at 4 o'clock, she was eating this enormous, fancy, expensive dinner that was paid for by taking some valuables left in the house and selling them. On one occasion, when an execution had just been put in, coming home through some chance as early as 6 o'clock, I saw her lying, of course with a twin, under the grate in a swoon, with her hair all torn about her face, but I never knew her more cheerful than she was that very same night, over a veal cutlet before the kitchen fire, telling me stories about her papa and mama and the company they used to keep. So she's a very confusing kind of person. One minute she's panicking and worried about money, and the next minute she's eating very expensive food and very happy. In this house and with this family, I passed my leisure. I passed my leisure time. My own exclusive breakfast of a penny loaf and a penny worth of milk I provided myself. I kept another small loaf and a modicum of cheese on a particular shelf of a particular cupboard to make my supper on when I came back at night. This made a hole in the 6 or 7 shillings, I know well, and I was out at the warehouse all day and had to support myself on that money all the week from Monday morning until Saturday night. I had no advice, no counsel, no encouragement, no consolation, no assistance, no support of any kind from anyone that I can call to mind as I hope to go to heaven. I was so young and childish and so little qualified. How could I be otherwise? To undertake the whole charge of my own existence that often, and going to the Murdstone and Grimby's of a morning, I could not resist the stale pastry put out for sale at half price at the pastry cook's doors. So he's saying, I'm just a 10-year-old boy. I don't know how to take care of myself. I don't know how to manage money. Nobody's helping me. So he would do these stupid things with money, like buying a pastry, a little treat, a little sweet treat at half price in the morning while walking to work. And spent in that money I should have kept for my dinner. But then he didn't have money for dinner later because he bought that sweet thing in the morning. Then I went without my dinner, so he didn't eat dinner. Or I bought a roll, or a slice of pudding. I remember 2 pudding shops between which I was divided, according to my finances. One was in a court close to St. Martin's Church, at the back of the church, which is now removed altogether. The pudding at that shop was made of currants, and was rather special pudding, but was dear. That means it was expensive. 2 pennyworth, but not being larger than a pennyworth of a more ordinary pudding. So it was twice as expensive as a regular pudding, but it was smaller. But it was very, very good. A good shop for the latter was in the Strand, somewhere in that part which has been rebuilt since. I was a stout, pale pudding. It was a stout, pale pudding, heavy and flabby, with great flat raisins in it, stuck in whole. At wide distances, it came up hot at about my time every day. Oh, sorry, I've lost my place. And many a day I did dine off it. So he was often eating these things that didn't make sense, these puddings, which are sweet and maybe not healthy and maybe not filling and kind of expensive. But he ate them all the time. When I dined regularly and handsomely, I had a saveloy and a penny loaf. What's a saveloy? Well, let's see if we can find a picture. Saveloy. I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it. I imagine that's how you pronounce it. Saveloy. It's a type of highly seasoned sausage. Wait, let's see if we can find the pronunciation.
Saveloy.
Okay, I was right. So it's a type of sausage. Let's look at a picture of a saveloy. That's a saveloy. Yeah, it looks like a hot dog. When I dined regularly and handsomely, I had a saveloy and a penny loaf, or a 4-penny plate of red beef from a cook's shop, or a plate of bread and cheese and a glass of beer, from a miserable old public house opposite our place of business called the Lion, or the Lion and something else that I've forgotten. Once I remember carrying my own bread, which I had brought from home in the morning, under my arm, wrapped in a piece of paper, like a book, and going to a famous a la mode beef house near Drury Lane, and ordering a small plate of that delicacy to eat with it. What the waiter thought of such a strange little apparition, coming in alone, I don't know. But I can see him now, staring at me as I ate my dinner, and bringing up the other waiter to look. I gave him a half-penny for himself, and I wish he hadn't taken it, So Davy went into a place that only usually an adult would probably go to, and he sat and he ordered a big dinner, and the waiter thought that was very strange, and he even brought other people to come look at him. And Davy even offered him a tip, which the waiter took, and Davy said, "I wish he hadn't taken it. I needed that money." We had half an hour, I think, for tea. When I had money enough, I used to get half a pint of ready-made coffee and a slice of bread and butter. When I had none, I used to look at a venison shop in Fleet Street. Or I have strolled at such a time as far as Covent Garden Market and stared at the pineapples. I was fond of wandering about the Adelphi, because it was a mysterious place with those dark arches. I see myself emerging one evening from some of these arches at a little public house close to the river with an open space before it, where some coal heavers were dancing. Heaving means like picking something up that's very heavy. So coal heavers are probably people who deliver coal to the houses for heat. To look at whom I sat down upon a bench, I wonder what they thought of me. I was such a child and so little that frequently, when I went into the bar of a strange public house for a glass of ale or porter to moisten what I had for dinner, they were afraid to give it to me. I remember one hot evening I went into the bar of a public house and said to the landlord, "What is your very best ale? A glass." For it was a special occasion. I don't know what. It may have been my birthday. "2 pence halfpenny," said the landlord, "is the price of the genuine stunning ale." "Then," says I, producing the money, "just draw me a glass of the genuine stunning ale, if you please, with a good head to it." The landlord looked at me in return over the bar from head to foot with a strange smile on his face. So this little boy, 10 years old, ordering a big glass of beer, expensive beer, and the landlord is looking at him like, "What is this?" And instead of drawing the beer, looked round the screen and said something to his wife. She came out from behind it with her work in her hand and joined him in surveying me. So he didn't give him the beer, but he called his wife over, and then he and his wife were just looking at him. Here we stand, all three before me now, the landlord in his shirt sleeves, leaning against the bar window frame, his wife looking over the little half door, and I, in some confusion, looking up at them from outside the partition. They asked me a good many questions, as what my name was, how old I was, where I lived, how I was employed, and how I came there, to all of which that I might commit nobody, I invented, I'm afraid, appropriate answers. Let me read that again. That's confusing. They asked me a good many questions as what my name was. So they asked him what his name was, how old he was, where he lived, how he was employed, how he came there. To all of which that I might commit nobody, I invented. So he lied. So when he asked these questions, he lied to them. I invented, I'm afraid, appropriate answers. He was afraid to tell the truth, so he gave them answers he thought were good. He thought that would make them happy, and then they would leave him alone. They served me with the ale, though I suspect it was not the genuine stunning, and the landlord's wife, opening the little half door of the bar and bending down, gave me my money back and gave me a kiss that was half admiring and half compassionate, but all womanly and all good. So eventually they did give him the beer. It probably wasn't the expensive fancy beer that he ordered. And also they didn't take his money. They returned his money, and the wife gave him a kiss because she felt bad for him. I know I do not exaggerate unconsciously and unintentionally the scantiness of my resources or the difficulties of my life. I know that if a shilling were given me by Mr. Quinion at any time, I spent it in a dinner or a tea. I know that I worked from morning until night with common men and boys, a shabby child. They keep using that word shabby, which means dirty or not taking care of yourself. So Davy looked dirty. He didn't look clean. He didn't look nice. He was a shabby child. I know that I lounged about the streets, insufficiently and unsatisfactorily fed. I know that, but for the mercy of God, I might easily have been, for any care that was taken of me, a little robber or a little vagabond. So, if he didn't have that job, and he didn't have that past upbringing, probably at this moment in life he would be a criminal. So he was this close to just being a criminal, like a street kid. Yet I held some station at Murdstone and Grimby's too. Besides that, Mr. Quinion did what a careless man so occupied in dealing with a thing so anomalous could, to treat me as one upon different footing from the rest. I never said to man or boy how it was that I came to be there, or gave the least indication of being sorry that I was there. So Davy, the manager of the factory treated Davy special because he was Mr. Murdstone's stepson. But nobody knew that, and Davy never talked about it, and he never acted like this was a bad place to be. He always tried to do his work as cheerfully as he could. But the manager of the factory treated him differently, with more respect, because he was the stepson of one of the owners. But nobody else knew that about Davy. That I suffered in secret, and that I suffered exquisitely, no one ever knew but I. How much I suffered, it is, as I've said already, utterly beyond my power to tell. But I kept my own counsel. I did my work. I knew from the first that if I could not do my work as well as any of the rest, I could not hold myself above slight and contempt. So Davy decided to work as hard as everybody else, and not to feel bad, and not to complain. Because if he did those things, then maybe what Mr. and Miss Murdstone said about him earlier was true, that he's good for nothing. I soon became, at least, as expeditious and as skillful as either of the other boys. Though perfectly familiar with them, my conduct and manner were different enough from theirs to place a space between us. They and the men generally spoke of me as the little gent, or the young Suffolker. A certain man named Gregory, who was the foreman of the packers, and another named Tip, who was the carman, and wore a red jacket, used to address me sometimes as David, but I think it was mostly when they were very confidential, and when I had made some efforts to entertain them over our work, with some results of the old readings, which were fast perishing out of my remembrance. So the other boys, who had a very different upbringing than Davy, could see that he was different. He spoke differently. He acted differently. So they called him the little gent, the little gentleman. And they understood that he was different from them. And there were two boys who used to call him David. I'm not really sure what that's supposed to mean, but I guess it means that they were trying to be friendly to him. Because it says that they sort of became friends. When Davy was in school at Salem House, the way that he made friends was he told stories at night. So when all the boys were going to sleep, Davy would tell stories from books that he had read. And the boys liked that, and it became a nightly ritual. And Davy enjoyed it too. And now he can barely remember those stories. It seems like such a long time ago. But he's trying to remember the stories. And while they're working, sometimes he tells these same stories. And that's beginning to make the other boys enjoy him or like him. Mealy Potatoes uprose once and rebelled against my being so distinguished, but Mick Walker settled him in no time. My rescue from this kind of existence I considered quite hopeless and abandoned. As such, altogether, I solemnly convinced that I never for 1 hour was reconciled to it, or was otherwise than miserably unhappy. But I bore it, and even to Peggotty, partly for the love of her, and partly for shame, never in any letter, though many passed between us, revealed the truth. So Davy never complained. He never told anybody how sad he was. Even Peggotty, when he would write to Peggotty, he didn't want to worry her. So he never told her how sad he was and how miserable he was. Mr. Micawber's difficulties were in addition to this distressed state of mind. In my forlorn state, I became quite attached to the family, and used to walk about, busy with Mrs. Micawber's calculations of ways and means, and heavy with the weight of Mr. Micawber's debts. So Davy became friends with the Micawber family, and he used to spend time with Mrs. Micawber while she was worrying about how she was going to pay for everything, and while she was complaining and worrying about Mr. Micawber's debts, the money that he owes everyone. On a Saturday night, which was my grand treat, partly because it was a great thing to walk home with 6 or 7 shillings in my pocket, looking into the shops and thinking what such a sum would buy, and partly because I went home early, Mrs. Micawber would make the most heart-rending confidences to me, also on a Sunday morning, when I mixed the portion of tea or coffee I had bought over the night in a little shaving pot, and sat late at my breakfast. It was nothing at all unusual for Mr. Micawber to sob violently in the beginning of one of these Saturday night conversations, and sing about Jack's delight being his lovely Nan towards the end of it. Okay, well, he's just describing life at the Micawbers, and I don't know what else to say about that. Okay, I've known him to come home to supper with a flood of tears and a declaration that nothing was left but jail. So Mr. Micawber is always in this very dramatic, depressed state because he owes so much money, and he has no money. So he's afraid he's going to jail. And going to bed making a calculation of the expense of putting bow windows to the house. So he comes home crying, saying, "I'm going to jail. I have no money." But by the end of the night, he's thinking, with some money, maybe I could remodel the house. I could change the house and make it look more beautiful. In case anything turned up. Okay, now if something turns up, that means like a surprise. When something turns up, that means something appears as a surprise. And what that means here is, I think I would remodel the house. I will change the house if something turns up. That means if I find some surprise money. This was his favorite expression, in case anything turned up. That was his favorite expression. So he's always thinking, maybe I'll get some surprise money from somewhere. And Mrs. Micawber was just the same. So she had that same attitude. A curious equality of friendship, originating, I suppose, in our respective circumstances, sprung up between me and these people, notwithstanding the ludicrous disparity in our years. But I never allowed myself to be prevailed upon to accept any invitation to eat and drink with them out of their stock, knowing that they got on badly with the butcher and the baker, and had often not too much for themselves. So, Davy knows that this is a very strange relationship that they have. He's a young boy, and these are middle-aged people with children, but they've become friends. And he said, but he never took advantage of that. So, if they invited him to dinner, he wouldn't do it because he knew how little they had. And he didn't want to take any of that. So he never accepted their invitations to dinner. Until Mrs. Micawber took me into her entire confidence. This she did one evening as follows. "Master Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber, "I make no stranger of you, and therefore do not hesitate to say that Mr. Micawber's difficulties are coming to a crisis." So she's saying, Davy, you're my good friend, so I have no problem telling you we are in big trouble. That's really what she's saying. It made me very miserable to hear it. I looked at Mrs. Micawber's red eyes with utmost sympathy. "With the exception of the heel of Dutch cheese, which is not adapted to the wants of a young family," said Mrs. Micawber, "there's really not a scrap of anything in the larder." So Mrs. Micawber is saying, we have no food. We just have a little bit of cheese left, and that's it. I was accustomed to speak of the larder when I lived with Papa and Mama. I use the word almost unconsciously. What I mean to express is, there's nothing to eat in the house. "Dear me," I said in great concern. I had 2 or 3 shillings of my week's money in my pocket, from which I presume that it must have been on a Wednesday night when we held this conversation, and I hastily produced it. So I gave her the money that I had. I had 3 shillings left, and I gave her my money. With a heartfelt emotion, Mrs. Micawber to accept of them as a loan. But that lady, kissing me, making me put them back in my pocket, replied that she couldn't think of it. "No, my dear Master Copperfield," she said, far be it from my thoughts. But you have a discretion beyond your years. You can render me another kind of service, if you will, and a service I will thankfully accept of." So she's saying, no, I can't take your money from you, but maybe you can do something for me. "I have parted with the plate myself," said Mrs. Micawber, 6 tea, 2 salt, and a pair of sugars. "I have at different times borrowed money on it, in secret, with my own hands. But the twins are a great tie to me. With my recollections of Papa and Mama, these transactions are very painful. There are still a few trifles that we could part with. Mrs. Micawber's feelings would never allow him to dispose of them. Mr. Micawber's feelings would never allow him to dispose of them. And click it." I don't know what click it means here. This was the girl from the workhouse. "Being of a vulgar mind would take painful liberties if so much confidence was reposed in her. Master Copperfield, if I might ask you." So what she's saying is that when they've had these emergencies in the past, she has sold some of the valuable items that they had left in the house. Some of the silver, the tray that held the sugar, and the forks and the knives that were made of silver. She's sold them. Well, really, she pawned them, but let's say she sold them. She sold them to get money in secret. But now she has the twins, and it's very difficult for her to go and sell these items. She has a few things left that she wants to sell, but it would be too difficult for her to go because of her twins, her 2 babies. And she doesn't trust the servant, and Mr. Micawber would never allow her to do this if he knew about it. So she wants Davy to go and sell her valuable items. I understood Mrs. Micawber now, and begged her to make use of me to any extent. I began to dispose of the more portable articles of property that very evening, and went out on a similar expedition almost every morning before I went to Murdstone and Grimby's. So Davy said, yes, okay, I will help you. I will do this. I will go sell your items. And he started doing it every morning before work. He would go and sell her items, her valuable items, to get money. Mr. Micawber had a few books on a little chiffonnier. Let's see what a chiffonnier is.
Chiffonier.
Oh, they say chiffonnier. It's like a dresser, but let me show you a picture of a chiffonier. Here's one. That's a piece of furniture. Mr. Micawber had a few books on a little chiffonier, which he called the library, and those went first. I carried them one after another to a bookstall in the city road, one part of which, near our house, was almost all bookstalls and bird shops then, and sold them for whatever they would bring. The keeper of this bookstall, who lived in a little house behind it, used to get tipsy every night. That means a little bit drunk. So the owner of the bookstall used to get a little drunk every night, and to be violently scolded by his wife every morning. So he would get drunk at night, and in the morning his wife would be very angry with him for doing that. More than once, when I went there early, I had an audience of him in a turn-up bedstead, with a cut in his forehead and a black eye, bearing witness to his excess overnight. I'm afraid he was quarrelsome in his drink. So when Davy says that he used to get tipsy, tipsy means a little drunk. So if you have something to drink, you have a couple of glasses of wine, and somebody says, "Are you drunk?" "No, I'm just a little tipsy." That's what tipsy is. It's like a little drunk. But sometimes people can use the word tipsy in a polite way, which means getting drunk, but it's nicer to say tipsy. So when Davy says, what did he say actually? Let me just go back and read it. He used to get tipsy every night, so that sounds nice. Like, oh, he had a couple of drinks. But it sounds like he drank a lot, because he's got black eyes and he gets into fights and he's got cuts on his face. So I think Davy's just being polite when he says he gets tipsy. So sometimes when Davy would go there early in the morning, he would see the result of the night before. And he, with a shaking hand, endeavoring to find the needful things in one or other pocket of his clothes. So he would be so drunk that in the morning he was shaking. So he was getting more than tipsy, definitely. Which lay upon the floor, while his wife, with a baby in her arms and her shoes down at heel, never left off rating him. So his wife was always standing there holding a baby, yelling at him. Sometimes he had lost his money, and then he would ask me to call again. But his wife had always got some, and taken his, I dare say, while he was drunk, and secretly completed the bargain on the stairs as we went down together. At the pawnbroker's shop. So a pawn shop, that's if you go to a pawn shop, you bring something valuable and they give you money. But they also give you time, like maybe a few months, where you can come back and return the money, and probably a little extra, and receive the item back. That's a pawn shop. At the pawnbroker's shop, too, I began to be very well known. The principal gentleman who officiated behind the counter took a good deal of notice of me, and often got me, I recollect, to decline a Latin noun or adjective, or to conjugate a Latin verb in his ear while he transacted my business. After all of these occasions, Mrs. Micawber made a little treat, which was generally a supper, and there was a peculiar relish in these meals, which I well remember. So relish means to enjoy something. So there was a peculiar enjoyment in having these meals. Davy would go sell an item, and when he did that and brought some money back, Mrs. Micawber would make a special treat, a special dinner that day. And there was something very enjoyable about that. There was a peculiar relish in these meals, which I remember. At last, Mr. Micawber's difficulties came to a crisis, and he was arrested early one morning and carried over to the King's Bench prison in the Borough. He told me, as he went out of the house, that the god of day had now gone down upon him. And I really thought his heart was broken, and mine too. But I heard afterwards that he was seen to play a lively game at skittles before noon. So one morning he was arrested, and it was very dramatic, and Mr. Micawber's heart was broken, and so was Davy's, and Davy was very worried about him. But then he heard that he was playing games by afternoon. Very happy. On the first Sunday after he was taken there, I was to go and see him and have dinner with him. I was to ask my way to such a place, and just short of that place I should see another place, and just short of that I should see a yard, which I was to cross, and keep straight until I saw a turnkey. All this I did, and when at last I did see a turnkey, poor little fellow that I was, and thought, how when Roderick Random was in his debtor's prison, there was a man there with nothing on him but an old rug, the turnkey swam before my dimmed eyes and my beating heart. I have no idea what they're talking about here. Is a turnkey maybe the guard? The person who opens the... We use that word turnkey now in modern English in North America, but that means something different. A jailer. Okay, so that's the person in the jail that has the key. Maybe now this will make more sense. Let's see. All this I did, and when at last I did see a turnkey, so when I did see the guard, the guard that holds the key to the jail, poor little fellow that I was, and thought how when Roderick Random was in debtor's prison, there was a man there with nothing on him but an old rug, the turnkey swam before my dimmed eyes and my beating heart. Okay, I still don't understand that sentence, but let's move on. Mr. Micawber was waiting for me within the gate, and we went up to his room, top story but one, and cried very much. He solemnly conjured me, I remember, to take warning by his fate, and to observe that if a man had £20 a year for his income, and spent £19, 19 shillings and 6 pence, he would be happy. But if he spent £20 he would be miserable. So, in other words, if you have £20 and you spend less than £20, you'll be happy. But if you have £20 and you spend £21, you'll be miserable. That's what he's saying. After which he borrowed a shilling of me for porter, and gave me a written order on Mrs. Micawber for the amount, and put away his pocket handkerchief, and cheered up. So he borrowed a shilling from Davy to get some wine, but he wrote out a little receipt and gave it to Davy to give to Mrs. Micawber, so that they would pay him back officially. We sat before a little fire, with 2 bricks put within the rusted grate, one on each side to prevent it burning too many coals, until another debtor, who shared the room with Mr. Micawber, came in from the bakehouse with the loin of mutton, which was our joint stock repast. Then I was sent up to Captain Hawkins, to the room overhead, with Mr. Micawber's compliments. And I was his young friend, and would Captain Hawkins lend a knife and a fork. So they sent him upstairs to another prisoner to ask for some eating utensils. Mr. Micawber's compliments, and I was his young friend, and would Captain Hawkins lend me a knife and a fork. Captain Hawkins lent me the knife and fork with his compliments to Mr. Micawber. There was a very dirty lady in his little room, and two wan girls. What does that mean? Wan, W-A-N. Pale and giving the impression of illness or exhaustion. Pale, weak. So there was a dirty old woman in the room with Captain Hopkins and two wan girls. I've never heard that word before. I don't think that it's a word that people use now that I know of. But that means sick looking, sick and pale looking. There was a very dirty lady in his little room and two wan girls, his daughters, with shock heads of hair. I thought it was better to borrow Captain Hopkins' knife and fork than Captain Hopkins' comb. So Davy went up there to ask to borrow the knife and fork, and he sees these girls with this crazy hair, very dirty, and he's thinking, "Wow, I'm glad that I'm borrowing the knife and fork and not his comb." Okay, let's see. The captain himself was in the last extremity of shabbiness. So they keep using this word shabby, which means dirty, not well taken care of. And here in this sentence, it says the last extremity of shabbiness. So Captain Hopkins was extremely shabby, extremely dirty, extremely miserable. With large whiskers and an old brown greatcoat with no other coat below it. I saw his bed rolled up in the corner, and what plates and dishes and pots he had on a shelf, and I divined, God knows how, that though the two girls with the shock heads of hair were Captain Hopkins' children, the dirty lady was not married to Captain Hopkins. My timid station on his threshold was not occupied more than a couple of minutes at most, but I came down again with all of this in my knowledge, as surely as the knife and fork were in my hand. So I guess Davy is speculating that woman is his girlfriend and not his wife, which at that time I think would have been pretty shocking. I think that's what he's saying. I'm not sure. There was something gypsy-like and agreeable in the dinner after all. I took back Captain Hopkins' knife and fork early in the afternoon and went home to comfort Mrs. Micawber with an account of my visit. She fainted when she saw me return, and made a little jug of egg hot afterwards to console us while we talked over it. Okay, I have to see what egg hot is. Egg hot. An egg hot was supposed to make you feel better on a cold winter's night. Let's see. Is a hot drink consisting of beer and eggs, sweetened and seasoned with nutmeg. Oh, that doesn't sound very nice. I wouldn't like to drink that. I don't know how the household furniture came to be sold for the family benefit, or who sold it, except that I did not. Sold it was, however, and carried away in a van. So now the furniture of the house was gone. Somebody sold it. With these possessions we encamped, as it were, in the two parlors of the emptied house in Windsor Terrace, Mrs. Micawber, the children, the orphan, and myself, and lived in those rooms night and day. I have no idea for how long, though it seems to me for a long time. At last, Mrs. Micawber resolved to move into the prison, where Mr. Micawber had now secured a room to himself. So now, before Mr. Micawber was sharing a cell with another person, but now he had his own private cell, and so Mrs. Micawber decided to stay in the prison with her husband. So I took the key of the house to the landlord, who was very glad to get it, and the beds were sent over to the King's Bench, except mine, for which a little room was hired outside the walls, in the neighborhood of that institution, very much to my satisfaction, since the Micawbers and I had become too used to one another and our troubles to part. So they had to leave the house where they were staying. Mrs. Micawber stayed with Mr. Micawber in the prison, and Davy rented a little room next to the prison, near the prison. And he was happy about that because he had become very comfortable with the Micawbers. The Orpheling was likewise accommodated with an inexpensive lodging in the same neighborhood. Mine was a quiet back garret with a sloping roof, commanding a pleasant prospect of the timber yard. And when I took possession of it with the reflection that Mr. Micawber's troubles had come to a crisis at last, I thought it was quite a paradise. All this time I was working at Murdston and Grimby's in the same common way, with the same common companions, and with a sense of unmerited degradation as at first. But I never, happily for me no doubt, made a single acquaintance or spoke to any of the many boys whom I saw daily in going to the warehouse and coming from it, and in prowling about the streets at meal times. So Davy is saying he continued working at Murdston and Grimby, but he avoided talking to people as much as possible. He didn't make any friends. I led the same secretly unhappy life, but I led it in the same lonely, self-reliant manner. The only changes I am conscious of are, firstly, that I had grown more shabby, so dirtier and not looking very well, not dressing very well. His clothes looked bad. That I was now relieved of much of the weight of Mr. and Mrs. Micawber's cares. For some relatives or friends had engaged to help them at their present pass, and they lived more comfortably in the prison than they had lived for a long while out of it. So some relatives are now helping the Micawbers, and they actually seem happier in the prison. They're living better, eating better, and not so worried in the prison. So Davy doesn't have to worry about them so much anymore. I used to breakfast with them now, in virtue of some arrangement, of which I have forgotten the details. I forget, too, at what hour the gates were opened in the morning, admitting of my going in. But I know that I was often up at 6 o'clock, and that my favorite lounging place in the interval was Old London Bridge, where I was wont to sit, in one of those stone recesses, watching the people going by, or to look over at the balustrades, at the sun shining in the water and lighting up the golden flame on the top of the monument. The Orpheling met me here sometimes, to be told some astonishing fictions respecting the wharves and the tower, of which I can say no more than that I hoped I believed them myself. In the evening I used to go back to the prison and walk up and down the parade with Mr. Micawber, or play casino with Mrs. Micawber, and hear reminiscences of her papa and mamma. Whether Mr. Murdston knew where I was, I am unable to say. I never told them at Murdston and Grimby's. Mr. Micawber's affairs, although past their crisis, were very much involved by reason of a certain deed, of which I used to hear a great deal, and which I suppose now to have been some former composition with his creditors. A deed is a certificate that says you own something, like some land. So there seems to be some kind of problem or dispute with a deed, with a certificate. Somebody owns something valuable, like a house or land. Though I was so far from being clear about it then, that I am conscious of having confounded it now, that it was demoniacal, that those demoniacal parchments which are held to have once upon a time obtained to a great extent in Germany, At last this document appeared to be got out of the way somehow. At all events, it seemed to be the rock ahead. It had been. And Mr. Micawber informed me that her family had decided that Mr. Micawber should apply for his release under the Insolvent Debtors Act, which would set him free, she expected, in about 6 weeks. And then, said Mr. Micawber, who was present, I have no doubt I shall, please heaven, begin to be beforehand with the world, and to live in a perfectly new manner, if, in short, anything turns up. So it seems as though Mr. Micawber will be able to leave the prison after 6 weeks because there's a new law, or there's a law that they're using to get him out of the prison. And now Mr. Micawber is saying, once I'm gone, once I'm free, I'll have a new life if something turns up, meaning if I find a job or if somehow I get some magical surprise money. By way of going in for anything that might be on the cards, I call to mind that Mr. Micawber, about this time, composed a petition to the House of Commons, praying for an alteration in the law of imprisonment for debt. I set down his remembrance here, because it is an instance to myself of the manner in which I fitted my old books to my altered life, and made stories for myself, out of the streets and out of the men and women, and how some main points in the character I shall unconsciously develop, I suppose in writing my life, were gradually forming all this while. There was a club in the prison, in which Mr. Micawber, as a gentleman, was a great authority. Mr. Micawber had stated his idea of this petition to the club, and the club had strongly approved of the same. So they wanted to write a letter to the House of Commons demanding their release from the debtor's prison. Wherefore Mr. Micawber, who was a thoroughly good-natured man, and as active as a creature about everything but his own affairs, as ever existed, and never so happy as when he was busy about something that could never be of any profit to him, set to work at the petition, invented it, engrossed it on an immense sheet of paper, and spread it out on the table, and appointed a time for all the club, and all within the walls, if they chose, to come up to his room and sign it. So he wrote this very official letter to the House of Commons, and he had all the prisoners come up and sign the petition. When I heard of this approaching ceremony, I was so anxious to see them all come in, one after another, though I knew the greater part of them already, and they me, that I got an hour's leave of absence from Murdston and Grimby's, and established myself in a corner for that purpose. So Davy was very excited for some reason about this event, and he even got permission to leave work early so that he could go there and watch them all sign the document. As many of the principal members of the club as could be got into a small room without filling it, supported Mr. Micawber in front of the petition, while my old friend Captain Hopkins, who had washed himself to do honor to so solemn an occasion, stationed himself close to it, to read it to all those who were unacquainted with its contents. So first they read it out loud in a big ceremony. The door was then thrown open, and the general population began to come in a long file, several waiting outside, while one entered and affixed his signature and went out to everybody in succession. Captain Hopkins said, "Have you read it? No? Would you like to hear it read?" If he weakly showed the least disposition to hear it, Captain Hopkins, in a loud, sonorous voice, gave him every word of it. The captain would have read it 20,000 times if 20,000 people would have heard him. One by one, I remember a certain luscious roll he gave to such phrases as the people's representatives in Parliament assembled. So that means he read it in a very grand way. The people's representatives in the Parliament assembled. Your petitioners therefore humbly approach your honorable house. His gracious majesty's unfortunate subjects. These are all phrases that when he read them in a very special way. As if the words were something real in his mouth and delicious to taste. Mr. Micawber, meanwhile, listening with a little of an author's vanity and contemplating, not severely, the spikes on the opposite wall. As I walked to and fro between Southwark and Blackfriars, and lounged about at meal times in obscure streets, the stones of which may, for anything I know, be worn at this moment by my childish feet, I wonder how many of these were wanting in the crowd that used to come filing before me in review again, to the echo of Captain Hopkins' voice. When my thoughts go back now to that slow agony of my youth, I wonder how much of the histories I invented for such people hangs like a mist of fancy over well-remembered facts. When I tread the old ground, I do not wonder that I seem to see and pity, going on before me, an innocent romantic boy, making his imaginative world out of such strange experiences and sordid things. Well, that is the end of chapter 11 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Next time, we will read chapter 12, Liking My Life on My Own Account. No better, I form a great resolution. So in chapter 12, it sounds like he's starting to enjoy his life a little bit more. All right, well, thank you for sticking around and listening to the whole thing, and I will see you next time when we read chapter 11.